Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. It was a tough day for Michelle Troconis and her defense team. They lost several major motions, and it didn't help that Jennifer's mother, Gloria Farber, came to trial and testified. The most important motion that they lost would have to be Fotis Dulos' dying statement that Michelle Troconis was not guilty is not coming in. We'll talk about what was said, how it all came about, and why it's not coming in. So happy Wednesday, everybody. We are in the middle of the Michelle Troconis trial. She is charged with conspiring to murder her boyfriend's wife, Jennifer Dulos. Jennifer and Fotis Dulos were still married. They had been married for many years. They had 5 children together, but they had been separated for about 2 years. And now Fotis Dulos was accused of murdering Jennifer. He was with Michelle by this time. They've been together for a year and were living together in the house where Fotis and Jennifer Dulos used to live. So today the prosecution rested and the defense made several motions, which it lost, and we'll talk about those. And then we moved straight into the defense's case. So we are in the defense's case right now. Tonight, we're going to cover 4 areas. The first is the critical motions that the defense lost, what they were, why they lost, and why they matter, why they really do matter. There are 3 of them: Fotis's request for the divorce attorney, the motion for judgment of acquittal, and most importantly of all, that death letter. But the second thing we're going to cover is that it was not all bad news for the defense. We're going to talk about a piece of really good news for the defense, and also about some key points that the defense made during the cross-examination of Detective Kimball yesterday. That was probably the most critical cross-examination of the whole trial from the defense's perspective. And then the fourth thing we're going to talk about is what to expect going forward. So at the end, I'll take questions. So please save up for then. I'll tell you when to put that in. Now, and just as a side note, I am going to give you more on Michelle Troconis' third interrogation, which was absolutely pivotal from any perspective. What she said was critical. But as we've seen in the prior videos, the audio is very difficult to understand. So I like to put words in so you can read along and understand it a little better. And that takes some serious investment of time. I do a first run with AI, but then I go back through and try to make it a little more coherent, because AI does get some things really wrong sometimes. We've used some of the AI bloopers because they can be pretty funny. So I will be doing that, but it just takes more investment of time than I've had time to do. So we'll get back to that. I owe a couple of very grateful appreciations from last night that I didn't get to. One was to Robert Bates. I thanked him once, but he actually gave me 2 very generous super stickers, and I appreciated that very much. There were 3 that came in toward the end, and I wanted to say thank you to Janet Studdard. She said I was the most mannerly and thoughtful YouTuber she watches, which I thought was a very nice compliment. And then Ruth Nowak for the very generous super sticker, and JJ. I'm appreciative for all of those. And what I want to do is get started with the motions. I also want to say thank you to Marlon for gifting a lawyerly membership. We love our members and really appreciate having them. We have some really great emojis you can use in the chat as part of our communication. So let's get started with what it was, what these motions were about that the defense lost either today or yesterday. Some of them even began yesterday. Okay, the first one from today was, and it all does blur together because I'm watching it trying. I'm always a little bit behind. But Mike Rose was Fotis Dulos' divorce attorney. That's huge because that was it's huge from everybody's perspective. The prosecution believes that it was that contentious divorce and custody battle with Jennifer Dulos that drove Fotis Dulos to kill Jennifer. But Michelle Troconis says that doesn't make sense because Fotis Dulos did not have any reason to kill Jennifer now. Michelle says that, and several people testified to this, it wasn't just Michelle. Michelle hasn't testified, but she said it in the interrogation. And we've seen well, we've seen 3 of them at trial, and we've talked about 2.5 of them here on the channel. So what Michelle said was that there was a pivotal report from the divorce proceeding that said that Jennifer Dulos had mental health issues. Fotis was convinced from this that he was finally going to be granted at least part and probably total physical custody of his children at long last. He thought this was the big turnaround. This was when things were going to go right for him. And the defense wants to know why. If he thought everything was going well, why would he kill Jennifer now? That just doesn't make sense. It would be one thing if he did it when they were in the middle of things being really bad for Fotis, but it doesn't make sense, the defense says, for him to do that when it turns out that things are going better for him. But the problem is, from the defense perspective, the court has said that divorce proceeding, that's off limits. You can't bring that into this case. And that report, that's sealed, and you can't bring that into this case. The whole contempt thing that we're going to talk about later relates to that very report that was blown up extra large on Michelle Troconis' screen. The prosecution says she was trying to communicate and to leak this sealed document. That's why she's going to be prosecuted, or the court is going to hear contempt charges against her. And that I'll talk about that toward the end. So the defense says, even though we know, Judge, you've ruled that the divorce proceeding's out, we know that you've ruled that we can't put that report in, we still want Fotis' divorce attorney named Mike Rose. We still want Mike Rose to come to trial because there are things that he can talk about that aren't off limits. They mentioned something about a text between the attorney and Fotis about his haircut. I don't know why Fotis was texting his attorney about his haircut. But anyway, we don't know what that is about, and maybe that would be allowed. So this is kind of how it happened. The defense says we want some information that we think is not off limits. Now, attorney Mike Rose sent an attorney of his own to the hearing, and the attorney said, hey, we believe Attorney Rose, everything he knows that would be relevant is attorney-client privilege. He should not have to testify. That's what the prosecution wants too. So the court did not grant that request from Attorney Rose to not testify at all. Instead, what the court said is, I'm going to give a protective order about what he can talk about. I'm going to limit what he can talk about. So hand in to me something that would describe what you think would be reasonable, and I'm going to issue that order. So the defense did not completely lose that motion, in other words, because Attorney Rose is coming, but it's going to be very limited. It's going to be extremely limited, not including any of the things that the defense would really like to get in and that the defense thinks is important. The second big motion that the defense lost was the defense motion for acquittal. They argued that the prosecution had not presented enough evidence to go to the jury. The judge should just go ahead and rule based on what had come in so far that the defendant should be acquitted. The case ultimately would not even go to the jury. That's a really important motion, but it very rarely wins. It's always a long shot. I mean, you can kind of think about why. By the time the case gets to trial, it's been through law enforcement and then the prosecutor and a grand jury or some kind of preliminary hearing and then some pretrial motions. So it may not be a winner. It may be that the defendant will be acquitted, but it's usually not an obvious 100% loss. But what the defense does at that stage is say, look, the prosecution has now put in everything it had. It hadn't held anything back. This is its whole case. And if you just look at that, Judge, you can see that clearly there's not enough evidence to convict the defendant. That's the defense argument. So the judge made quick order of that. And the judge said, no, there is plenty for the jury to make a decision that Michelle conspired to murder Jennifer if they choose to do so. And remember, there are 2 other charges too, more than 2, but there are 2 other categories of charges: hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence. So the judge just ran through a list of some of the key pieces of evidence and said, look, the jury could look at this and that. First was Michelle told Pavel Gumieni an employee of Fotis Dulos, that Jennifer Dulos should be buried next to the dog. Now, there was more context around that. The dog was the family dog, the Dulos family dog, and elderly and dying. Fotis wanted the kids to be able to come and say goodbye to the family dog. And Jennifer said, no, you're not allowed to have visitation and they can't come. Fotis was angry, and that's what Michelle was talking about. Nonetheless, it's a pretty intense comment to say that someone should be buried next to the dog and they end up dead shortly after that. Obviously, timing was very significant. And the judge said, look, that even happened before Jennifer Dulos disappeared. So we're counting that as something the jury could look at and say, hey, she was involved. The second thing he mentioned was the blood on the cut garments, as he called them, in the trash on Albany Avenue. The prosecution's biggest piece of evidence probably is the videotape of Fotis Dulos with Michelle in the passenger seat, driving around Hartford, Connecticut, throwing trash bags into random street trash cans. And inside those, it were many items, but two of which were a cut straight up the front bra and shirt of Jennifer Dulos, covered with blood and Jennifer Dulos's DNA. And it was traced right back to Fotis Dulos. Michelle was in the passenger seat. And so the judge said, look, we've got these as a connection. Clearly, the jury can decide. It would not be irrational to decide. Will they decide? That's a completely different issue. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Different issue. This is just, can we even show the jury this case? Can we even let them make a choice? Then the third thing he mentioned was that Michelle told law enforcement that Fotis Dulos was at home on the morning that Jennifer disappeared. Now, later, Michelle took that story back and said, well, he may not have been at home. Come to think of it, she didn't really know if he was at home or not. And that could mean she knew, the judge said, that she was covering for Fotis Dulos. The fourth thing the judge pointed out was the fact that Michelle drove with Fotis Dulos to the car wash. Now, this is a little more complicated because what they were washing was a red Tacoma pickup truck that belonged to that employee I mentioned a minute ago, Pavel Gumieni. According to the prosecution, they believe that Fotis Dulos borrowed that red pickup truck and used it to drive down to New Canaan, which was about an hour and 20 minutes south of where he lived with Michelle, and to commit the murder of Jennifer Dulos. And the judge said, look, the jury could decide that when she went to get that pickup truck, not just washed, but detailed, knowing that that truck did not belong to either her or to Fotis Dulos, it belonged to Pavel Gumieni, then the jury could conclude she knew exactly what she was doing. But in my view, the worst by far of the motions that the defense lost was related to what I'll call the death letter. And I'm calling it that for YouTube reasons. Fotis Dulos unalived himself, but he left a note when he did. And I am actually, let me share my screen with you. And I will show you that this is the document that Fotis Dulos left, that he left when he unalived himself. And it says, and we're just going to read a couple of sentences of this. He said, I refuse to spend even an hour more in jail for something I had nothing to do with. Enough is enough. He also said, I want it to be known that Michelle Troconis had nothing to do with Jennifer's disappearance, and neither did Kent Maywinnie, who is a third person charged with the conspiracy. And he said, the state will not rest until I rot in jail. My attorney can explain what happened with the bags on Albany Avenue. Everything else is a story fabricated by law enforcement. So obviously, Michelle would really like to get that letter in, right? Because it suggests she had nothing to do with not just suggests, it states she had nothing to do with the death of Jennifer Dulos or the disappearance of Jennifer Dulos. But it's hearsay. She wants it in for truth that she really did not conspire to murder Jennifer Dulos, and Fotis Dulos is not here to say it. So the defense tried to figure out very hard how they could get that letter in. It could be hugely important to the jury, but it's hard to figure out for a defense how they're going to get this in. They said in court that they considered using the dying declaration exception. That's what it's called, to the hearsay rule. That really applies, though, when a victim is dying. If someone had come upon Jennifer and she had said, and she was near death and said, "Oh my God, it was Fotis," that would be a dying declaration. But the defense said that we're not even trying that because Fotis is not a victim. So this one doesn't really fit. Then the second thing they said they considered trying was a Sixth Amendment right to present a defense exception. In other words, we have the right to defend our client from a serious charge like murder, and everything related ought to be coming in. If it would help, then that should be fair game, because this isn't just playing around. This is a murder charge. And therefore, if this letter would be of help, it should come in. I can see a strong argument for that they will likely make on appeal. But what they said at the time was, "Judge, we acknowledge this is not something in Connecticut yet. There isn't a Sixth Amendment right to present a defense exception to the hearsay rule. So we're going to have to argue that on appeal." In other words, it's not probably something you can grant to us. That's at least how I heard what they were arguing. Then the third thing they wanted to talk about was, or they did argue, was the residual hearsay exception. And let me tell you a little bit about that. Okay. So this is the Connecticut residual hearsay exception. And you might kind of call this the miscellaneous catch-all, right? That's sort of the equivalent. A statement that is not admissible under any of the foregoing exceptions. In other words, this is the last place you go. If you can possibly think of another reason, you do. But if the court determines there is a reasonable necessity for the admission of the statement, and this is the one everybody focused on in the argument, the statement is supported by equivalent guarantees of trustworthiness and reliability that are essential to other evidence admitted under traditional exceptions to the hearsay rule. So the court said, look, with this note, there really aren't any special guarantees of trustworthiness. I mean, that sort of residual exception, that might work if if Fotis came into court and said, in the middle of Michelle's trial, and said, "Look, I did it. It wasn't Michelle. She had nothing to do with it. It wasn't Kent. It was all me. I'm sorry." And the judge said, look, that would be a situation where Fotis comes in and it's against his, what the judge kept referring to as penal interest, because he could end up penalized for it. He could end up with consequences for it. But here, Fotis exonerated himself and Michelle and Kent Maywinnie. So it wasn't as if he was accepting blame in any way. He wasn't. He was deflecting blame. He was saying, I didn't do it and they didn't do it. One other thing nobody mentioned, but that did occur to me, is if in fact Fotis did not do it, well, how does he really know that Michelle and Kent Maywinnie did not do it? Because he wasn't there. He doesn't really know what happened. He knows for sure he didn't do it, but he wouldn't know that. Nobody mentioned that, but it did occur to me that that might be another problem with admitting the evidence. So the court just looked at this and said, look, there's nothing about this that is trustworthy, and I'm not going to let this note in. I'm not going to allow it. So all the defense got in was the death certificate for Fotis Dulos, saying he's no longer alive. Really meager compared to the note saying Michelle didn't do it. That really obviously is not going to be all that significant to the jury. And this was a really important piece of evidence. I think the judge ultimately had to make the ruling that the judge did. I do think that they will have an argument on appeal related to that Sixth Amendment right to present a defense. I think that'll be something that we'll hear more about in the future. So I want to say thank you to Spunky for gifting a lawyerly membership. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you to Posse Vibes who gifted 5 memberships. That's awesome. It is so awesome to see y'all working with other people and bringing more people into the fold because it's a lot of fun. We've really enjoyed the memberships. We just started on Friday, so it's a new thing, but we've really been enjoying all the emojis and all of that. So I don't want to leave the impression, though, that everything went poorly for the defense, because there were a couple of really important pieces of information that came out that were good for the defense. And probably the most important was the fact that Kent Maywinnie will not testify. The prosecution had Kent Maywinnie on their witness list. Kent Maywinnie is the third conspirator, also accused of conspiring to murder Jennifer Dulos. It's always been a little unclear to me exactly what it is that Kent Maywinnie did as part of the conspiracy. It was never fully clear to me. He has not been granted immunity. He is being prosecuted, but there was a lot of speculation that maybe a deal was being struck between the state and Kent, and that he would come and that he would testify against Michelle Troconis. It's not really clear what happened in that. Did they even try to reach a deal? That was just the rumor. But in fact, what happened was the prosecution announced Kent Maywinnie will be taking the Fifth Amendment and therefore will be deemed not available because he's not actually going to say anything if he comes. He'll just take the Fifth Amendment. That was a piece of good news for Michelle's team, because obviously having a, quote, co-conspirator, someone directly accused of conspiring with you, come in and say, these are all the bad things that she did and all the ways that she conspired, would have been really significant with the jury. And now that won't happen. I also want to take you just very quickly through some key pieces of cross-examination that the defense did during the testimony yesterday of Detective Kimball. He was the person who put in that third interview with Michelle, and he kind of put together a lot of the evidence that the state has been talking about. He was the lead detective, so he was the person to synthesize everything and sort of explain how it all fit together, at least to some degree. So there were several ways that the defense did their cross-examination, and I wanted you to know where they were headed and what their arguments were. One was they argued, look, Michelle was trying to be helpful. She never got up and walked out. She never said, no, I'm not going to answer that. I'll answer this and that, but not this one. She answered everything. She stayed there. She didn't take a break other than, restroom break, and she answered all your questions. The second thing they talked about was that the detectives themselves had admitted several times, at least Kimball had, making some mistakes during the interrogation. That was essentially what Michelle was doing. That's the defense argument. So Michelle made some mistakes. Let me give you a couple of examples and explain to you how the defense argued this. So the detectives, for example, Michelle said, my daughter called me at 12:59 a.m. the morning Jennifer disappeared, and I went down to sleep with her in her bedroom. She was scared. It was there was a thunderstorm. She got scared, so I went down with her. Therefore, I didn't wake up in the same room with Fotis. Initially, she said he was in the house. Then she said he wasn't in the house. Of course, the prosecution believes that's the very morning when Fotis Dulos drove down to New Canaan, murdered Jennifer Dulos, and did something unknown with her body, which has never been found. So Michelle says to the detective, my daughter called me. I went down to be with her because of the thunderstorm. And Detective Kimball said, no, we know you're not telling us the truth. We know that for sure because of the fact that I've looked up the weather and there weren't any thunderstorms in the area. So this is false. Why are you lying to us? Tell us the truth. We know there weren't thunderstorms. Now, the detective later admitted that he had gotten his data from a weather source that had ended up referring him, I think it was 24 miles away, something like that, to an airport. In fact, weather data was presented for the area where Michelle actually lived, and there was, in fact, a storm that night. The defense even presented video of that. So that was the kind of mistake that I'm talking about, where they were very strong that there was no rain, and then it turned out, okay, there was rain. Another example of that would be that the detective during the first interview, Detective Kimball said to Michelle's attorney, let me stop and say something to your attorney. I think it was Kimball said, let me say something to your attorney. I want you to know she's saying she's innocent, but there were 30 different stops in Hartford, 30 stops. And which sounds appalling, like, Why? Why would there be 30 stops throwing out trash in Hartford? And so at that point, the attorney doesn't really say anything, but it turns out that that was incorrect. There were actually 3 and possibly 4 that they have video for. There may have been others, but that was all that they actually had evidence of. And the detective said, okay, mistake. I don't remember exactly where I heard that, but I did hear that. So the defense argued, look, if you can make mistakes and say, okay, I'm not lying, I just made a mistake, why can't Michelle say that? Why can't Michelle say, I wasn't lying when I said Fotis was there, I just made a mistake? What's different about it? And of course, you can think of your own arguments about why it would be different, but that's the argument that the defense made during the cross-examination. And the third thing that they approached was, or that they talked about, was that it wasn't really Michelle's fault that she didn't volunteer some useful information because detectives didn't ask her about it. When they did ask her, she told them the answer. And they argued that sort of throughout that cross-examination of Detective Kimball. I'll give you a couple of examples of what the defense was talking about. So the defense is saying, if you wanted to know about some of these things, you should have asked. She had no way of knowing they were important. An example would be where Michelle was on May 29th and about the car wash that Fotis and Michelle went to. Now, we know, we talked about it just a few minutes ago, about the fact that what was being washed was not Fotis's car. It wasn't Michelle's car. It was the employee's pickup truck that the prosecution believes was used to commit the murder. But how was she supposed to know that that was relevant? It was 5 days after Jennifer disappeared. It was a car wash. And the defense argument was, look, if you didn't ask her about the red Tacoma, how was she supposed to know that this red Tacoma was important? How was she supposed to know that you thought this car wash was important? It seemed really mundane and ordinary to her. Now, the prosecution, of course, believes there's nothing ordinary about detailing someone else's car. That's really weird behavior. And so they think she should have volunteered that. But the defense argument was, look, she answered absolutely everything that you asked her. So you can't say, oh, you didn't volunteer these things if she didn't know they were important. Another example would be about the fires in the fireplace. And the defense argument is, okay, so she didn't mention that, but is it really all that natural to say, oh, just in case you were wondering, I had some fires in the fireplace on the day that Jennifer disappeared? But they weren't connected, don't worry. So the defense says, it's not normal to volunteer that. You should have asked. A fourth thing that they did on cross-examination, and one of the most important, I thought, was to point out where the law enforcement officers, detectives, elected to give false information to try to pull out some information from Michelle. And one example would be when Detective Clabby talked about the blood on the door. We played a clip of that last night, and because Michelle said she and Fotis had sex in the side of the red Tacoma pickup truck, and the detective said, we shown luminol there. There was blood there. That was Jennifer's blood. What do you think about that? And detective, as it turned out, though, the luminol showed blood, but it ended up not testing positive for Jennifer Dulos's DNA. It could have been that it showed up because of the fact that bleach had been there. It had been cleaned. It doesn't mean that the prosecution was wrong, but the defense argument was, look, that was false information that you gave her. The fifth was that the defense argued, look, she gave you a lot of your very best information. She didn't hold back. She told you who was in the car. In each of the cars that went back and forth we talked about this last night, between 80 Mountain Spring and Michelle and Fotis's house. And she volunteered that she picked up the phone call from Andreas Toutzardis, the Greek friend of Fotis. She gave you this. She didn't hold it back. And that was their argument. So now I want to do a little, I have a bunch of people to thank. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that super sticker very much. And I will get to each of these, but I want to do a little bit on what we can expect and what's coming up. So the defense said it's going to take about 3 days to present the defense side of the case. They expect to be finished on Friday. The judge's like, well, things take longer than you think, maybe Monday. So somewhere in there. Then the court said that he is going to take a break for the contempt hearing. He wanted to give the attorneys time to prepare for that contempt hearing. Michelle has been accused of showing this sealed document to the courtroom, blowing it up big in an attempt, the prosecution says, to leak this document that she knew wasn't allowed to be in the public domain. And the Judge Randolph said, look, I don't want to interrupt the defense. I want this to go straight through prosecution defense, but I do want to take that up before the case ends. The best guess then would be that Friday or Monday, the defense is going to rest, and then the state is going to have some rebuttal case, but they said not a lot. Don't expect a lot to come out during that period. So on Monday, the judge said, I'm expecting us to have the charge conference. Now, what's that? That's you may have seen the judge read charges to the jury at the end of a case, and that says, here's the law, here's what you're going to do as the jury. And before that happens, the two sides get together and they argue about what the court should say in that charge. It's one of the most important, if kind of technical, things about the whole case. What exactly will the jury hear right before they go deliberate that they ought to do? What are they going to hear the law is going to be and how they ought to apply it? So the charge conference is when everybody talks about, okay, what's going to be said to the jury. So they're going to have that charge conference. Then they're also going to have the contempt hearing. Now, and the judge mentioned taking a break to allow counsel to prepare, but then it also sounded to me like he planned to go straight into that. So I don't think it'll be all that long. So he said this quote, we're going to be here a lot longer than March 1, which kind of surprised me. I'm not really sure that it would take all that long, but I thought that was a really interesting comment. If there is a finding of contempt, and he's going to have a whole hearing on it, he said that sanctions are going to be imposed when the verdict is returned, whether guilty or not guilty on all counts. So the hearing will be held. He's not going to rule right then and there. He's going to wait until the verdict comes back. And at that point, it could go a couple of different ways. Let's say Michelle is found guilty. She might still go to jail for 90 days or whatever he chooses for the contempt. But if she's found guilty, he might say, did I say not guilty? That's what I meant. I'm not sure which I said. If she's found guilty, then the judge might say, well, I'm going to run it concurrently. I'm going to send it to you to X number of days, but I'm running it concurrently. That could happen. Or could say it's going to be added on to the end. Any of those things could occur. But in any event, we won't know what the ruling is on that contempt motion until we get to the end of the case. That's when he's going to do it. We also got word from Felsen and that the two attorneys, Felsen and Schoenhorn, for Michelle Troconis had decided they cannot represent Michelle Troconis in the contempt hearing. That she's been reaching out to other attorneys and is trying to hire someone to represent her. Schoenhorn said, look, this happened, and he said this several times, this happened during my cross of a witness. In other words, I had nothing to do with this because I'm off here cross-examining the witness and she's over here doing this. I had no idea. I'm not paying any attention. I'm really head on into my cross-examination. I am not involved in that. And I don't think he would have said that if he weren't at least a little bit worried about what's going to occur. So, and Schoenhorn also said, it somewhat put us in a position that we may have information and therefore we can't be the ones to represent her. And go ahead, I'm going to run through these questions and super stickers, and then go ahead and put your questions in the comments. If you would put question marks at the beginning, that really helps me notice them, spot them. If you're a member and you have our emojis, you can put the question emoji in, and I will look for that too. Okay, Debbie J, thank you for your very generous super chat. And she asked the question, thoughts on the dialogue from the defense witnesses from today. So Debbie, as usual, I am a little late and I'm always a little bit behind because I watch some and then try to prepare and watch some and prepare. So I'm always a little bit behind. I know that in general, what they talked about, it really did seem like there was a significant attempt to show Fotis Dulos as a good dad and someone who loved his kids and wanted to be with them more. A nice guy, in other words. That's what I could tell so far, but I will delve into that tomorrow and answer your question more thoroughly when we get to that tomorrow. And let's see. Brian, thank you very much for the super sticker. I appreciate that very much. And Nightwood, I appreciate that very generous super sticker. So I'm going to flip over to some questions, leaving that up for just a minute and see what people had to say. Oh, wow. Lots of questions. Okay. I don't think we'll be able to do them all, but I will do as many as I can. All right. Let's see. So here we go. Greg Peters has one to start with. Okay. Do you think the Michelle Troconis interrogation audio is better for the jury than what it is for us? I know, right? I do think so. I've heard that. I've heard that it's clearer for them. I really hope so. They're sitting right there in the room. If it's not, that's just brutal, right? Because honestly, I have the AI do the interpretation, and then I sit and I listen to it over and over and a lot. I'm like, what was that? And sometimes you can guess, and sometimes you can figure it out. Sometimes you have no idea. You can see a lot of places in there where I just put question marks. Like, I don't know. They said something, but I have no idea what it is. There were even sections where I'm like, no one can understand that. I'm just going to cut that out because I'm editing it down anyway, just for the highlights, and it's unintelligible. I don't think anybody can hear that. There have been occasions we saw in the Adelson case where the court allowed the jury to have a transcript. They were actually able to see the words written out. Someone did that. It would be super helpful. I can also see where it could be somewhat controversial because people can hear different things, but it would be really helpful. I think having the words makes a big difference for me. I noticed too, when I listen to the audio of her interrogation, like I usually listen to this at double speed or at least, 1.75 because I'm always behind and trying to catch up. But not that. I mean, I have to listen to that at equal speed. I sometimes slow it down to 0.75 trying to hear what on earth are they saying. It's very difficult to hear and to understand. Okay, now I've lost my place here we go. Okay, so questions. All right, I'm looking for all the question marks at the beginning, per usual. Okay, Chris Showblock has sorry, I'm not getting that right. I wonder what they would have found out had they offered her immunity when Fotis was still alive and she knew she wouldn't go to jail. Good question. It really did appear, and the defense pointed it out. When they had that second interview, they brought in the state's attorney who's heads up the prosecutors for Connecticut. And that state's attorney, when Michelle and her attorney left and law enforcement and the state's attorney talked about the case, they taught some about Michelle. They said something like she would be really good or something like that. And they really seemed to be considering whether she could be the person to testify against Fotis. But they gave her 3 chances to turn state's evidence against him, and she did not. Huge argument for that is the defense argument. The reason she didn't is because she doesn't have anything to tell them. If she had anything, she'd have turned it over. She was so done with Fotis Dulos. She wasn't with him anymore. She wanted out of this. She would have cooperated in any way possible. She just didn't have anything. She didn't know anything that would give evidence against him. And you do hear that a lot in the interrogation. With somebody said she seems like she sees them as her equals. She very much did seem like she was working with them. Let's work together. Let's figure this out. What can I give you? What can you give me? How can we figure out and prove Fotis did this? So I do think that it would have been very different. I don't think she would be prosecuted in this same way. I think there would have been some kind of deal struck if Fotis had been alive. But without that, she really did not give them very much related to Fotis. And they really wanted that. And they made that very clear. Is it because she chose not to? Because she couldn't? That's exactly what the jury is going to decide. All right, I'm looking for the questions. I may have gone too far back. Oh, here we go. P. Lola's mom says, did Fotis dump Michelle or did Michelle move out and dump Fotis? And if they committed unliving, why would they break up? Someone knows the other's secret. Well, there's a good point. So she's saying, and this would especially be true for Fotis, it, wouldn't he, let's say Fotis committed the murder, wouldn't he want to keep Michelle close? But it became pretty clear that Michelle, they told her, law enforcement told her, there, he even last night, I keep going back to the thing. He took a picture. I showed this part in the video. He took a picture of Fotis and Michelle and he tore it in half. The lead detective did, Kimball, and he said, "This is no more. The two of you, that's not a thing anymore." And she said, "It's not. It's really not." And law enforcement made it really clear, you need to not be with him. And we're expecting you to not be with him. So I think that I feel like Michelle dumped Fotis. I don't know all the ins and outs, but she certainly made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with him during the interrogations. Was that true? Was it just a representation? That part I can't answer, but she definitely made that clear. Okay, looking for more questions. Let's see. And I think I went too far back because I know y'all, and you always have more questions than this. So, all right, I'm looking for the question marks. What? No one have any questions? Oh, wow. There are a bunch more left to go. I think I went way far back. Okay, Real Deal wants to know about Jennifer's mom. Why didn't the prosecutor ask if Michelle ever gave her money for the mortgage she was paying where she and Fotis were living? I am guessing that Jennifer's mother would not know about. So I think what Real Deal is saying is that I'm not sure I really understand your question, Real Deal. Maybe if you could write it out again. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking me, so I'm not sure how to answer that. And I don't really know for sure that she paid any part of the mortgage or didn't pay any part of the mortgage. I don't know. She did talk about the expenses she paid, and it sounded like Fotis covered everything except anything personal for Michelle or for her daughter, Nicole. Cognac Hobo wants to know about whether the camera has accidentally showed members of the jury to the viewers, and if that happened, could the trial continue? As far as I know, that absolutely hasn't happened, and it would really hurt whoever did that because they really rely on a good reputation. When Court TV or Law and Crime shows up, they have their reputation is their coin in trade. So they say, we're always very careful. We broadcast this in a way that doesn't do any harm to the process. We don't show the jury. We turn it off when there are private conferences with the court or at the tables. We don't listen in on things we shouldn't. So they're always suggesting to the court, you can trust us. So I think it would be unlikely that there would be any accidental showing of the jury. And yet, didn't we see that in the Murdaugh case? We did see a fleeting accidental showing of the jury at one point. Could the trial continue? Yes. I don't think that would be a reason to stop the trial. I don't think it would be a reason for a mistrial. In this particular case, I don't really see that there would be any danger or harm to the jury, but I'm sure the court would look into it very seriously, especially if the court thought there was any reason for that. Andrea Benson has a very good question. She wants to know, how did Michelle get that sealed document? And that's not entirely clear whether she had that and gave it to her lawyers. It wasn't really clear. The lawyers for Michelle said they had a copy, and they said the prosecution had a copy, but they didn't really explain kind of how it all happened. We didn't get all of the details about that. Okay, let's see. Kim Hartz wants to know, what's your take on the Fotis Dulos note? Why wouldn't he be completely honest? Theories. A lot of people, I think, feel like he would be honest. It was his last chance to communicate with anyone. Why wouldn't he be honest? I guess you could argue reasons he wouldn't be, since you're saying, speculate, Lee. So I guess reasons would be he wanted to have his kids not to have a bad impression of him. He didn't want to leave them with the, hey, I did this to your mom. He wanted to go out saying, I didn't do it. But he knew that this could have implications for Michelle, for Kent, and he really needed to do something about that. 0723 Trinity, wasn't Fotis dating someone else at the time of his death? Yes, someone named Anna Curry, who looked a whole lot like Michelle. That was one of the things that that law enforcement asked Michelle about in that third interview. We'll play that little clip probably tomorrow. Well, I mean, not tomorrow. Remember, we are not going live tomorrow night at 7. We'll next be live on Friday at 7, taking the day off tomorrow. Annie K., do you think the defense will have valid appeals based upon what was not allowed in trial? And why is some defense evidence off limits if the prosecution had to paint a complete picture? I do think that they have some significant grounds for appeal because a lot of evidence has been kept out. And anytime you have significant evidence kept out, there's going to be grounds for appeal. Somebody could feel differently about it. The appellate court could decide that should have come in. There were some significant things that were kept out. And so do I think they have a absolutely valid appeal? Now, winning appeal, valid appeal, somewhat different. And I think that most appeals, the majority of appeals don't win. So the chances are always low. The chances are always less than 50% that you're going to win an appeal. But I think that they are significant. Momo Shark reminding me, please do hit the likes up. Per usual, I've forgotten to ask for that. And if you are not a subscriber, we would love to have you as a subscriber. Please hit that button too. Nina Brown wanting to know, has anyone explained to Michelle why she was not allowed to be present during visitation? She seems to feel like it was personal that she had to leave, but it was just one of the rules. You know, I think, Nina, one of the things that kind of came across to me through some of the testimony and through the interrogation, it wasn't just that she wasn't allowed to be there when the children came. Whenever the children came, Michelle and her daughter had to leave, which was sort of, humiliating. They had to leave their own house. They had to go somewhere else so Fotis could be with his kids, sort of as if there was something wrong with Michelle, wrong with her daughter. But it was that it lasted and lasted and lasted. So it had been a year, and she still, that they had not been allowed to be together. And so I think the prosecution point was, it wasn't just that Michelle wasn't allowed to be with the kids. It's that it didn't seem to be changing. The court wasn't doing anything different. All right. Now, every time I do that, I do have the regret of then I lose my place. So, okay. No, I'm okay. Trudy wants to know, can she still be offered a plea deal? It's possible. I think that's pretty unlikely at this stage. I don't think they would have gone all this far if they could have reached an agreement on what would happen. So I think that it's not very likely at this stage. Jennifer wants to know, is there ever a time a judge could get into trouble not allowing relevant evidence that could affect the outcome? So let me kind of break that down, Jennifer. It's a real interesting question. So trouble, if by that you mean, could the judge be chastised by the appellate court? Like, that was really a bad idea. Like, you should have let that in. That would be really rare. Normally, the court would say, okay, this was what the trial court said. This wouldn't come in. We believe the court got it wrong. So it's being sent back down for a new trial or for a decision based on our decision as an appellate court saying you were wrong. Sometimes they get a little testy in the way they write it, and make it real clear that they strongly disagree with the trial judge, but it's usually fairly clinical. They said this, we think that's wrong. Here are the cases. Usually it's pretty dry. It's not normally something where they say anything negative. And that would just be saying something negative. Now, if there ended up being some kind of long-term proof of some bias, that might be a different issue, but it would not necessarily be inside of one case. It would have to probably be more than one case. I guess maybe, we'll be talking more about the Delphi murders case. And there are allegations by the defense that the judge in that case is biased against them. It's not just that she's biased against defendants in general, but against them specifically. So that might fit what you're talking about. However, may I say the appellate court said they weren't taking her off the case. All right. And yes, I know there's yet another motion by the defense to take her off the case, but that not very likely given the fact that the appellate court's already ruled on it once. All right. I thought law enforcement could lie during interviews. Laura B asked, can they? Well, they certainly made a point here that they can. And they said that openly in court. They said it's absolutely allowed. They talked about a ruse where you can say one thing when really something else was true. I do have some questions about whether as a society we think that's a good or reasonable idea. Do we believe that law enforcement should be allowed to lie to people who are being interrogated? Maybe we do. There are reasons to do that, say to force a confession, to find a body, to figure out what happened. But as a general rule, is that something we want? I thought about doing a whole video on that. And I may still, if that really interests y'all, would you, about like the lies that were told to Michelle Troconis, and is that appropriate or reasonable? If you'd be interested in that, put that in the comments, and I'd be interested to know how many people would like to see that. Patriotic wants to know, will the jurors be told about the contempt hearing? I don't think so. I don't think they'll know anything about it. I think it'll happen in its own little world, but they'll be there at the time that the judge announces what he's going to do, because he said he's going to do it along with the verdict, and then he's going to announce. The Traveler says it takes a lot to only have supervised visitation. Did Fotis have a history of violence? I didn't see anything that suggested history of violence. It seemed to relate to what Fotis was saying about Jennifer. And he not only about Jennifer, but also he told one of his sons, Michelle was there. She wasn't supposed to be there. And he told his son, don't tell anybody that Michelle is here. Don't tell your mom. And that was one of the reasons. There was also some kind of threat that he would take the kids to Greece and be gone with them and they wouldn't be around. I don't know the details about what happened in that hearing, but those are all the sorts of things I think that cause the supervised visitation. Okay, I answered Trinity's question. If she's convicted, how long will she be sentenced in your opinion? A very, very long time. That would be my guess. Yvette Muriel wants to know if she's convicted. Oh, same question. Okay, Seawolf Blue. And may I say, it does depend on what she gets convicted for. It's an entirely different thing if she gets convicted of hindering prosecution and not conspiring to murder Jennifer versus she's convicted of all of them. Those are all different sorts of things. Yes, Michael L. says, well, Fotis has been mentioned all trial long by the prosecution, even when Michelle was not a part of it. Why then isn't his cause of death relevant to her defense, including his note that he left? You and the defense are of one accord on that. And I personally, if I were a judge, I think I would be inclined to let that in, but I understand the reasons not to. If I can see reasons, though, strong appellate arguments for that Sixth Amendment right to be able to defend yourself. And so I would be very interested in what the arguments are on that. Jackie Corbett says, would a mental health diagnosis of personality disorder have had much influence on Jennifer having custody, or would her known ability to care for her children hold more strength? That is a question we honestly can't answer, but since we not only don't have the report, but we don't have sort of all the information around it. How was it going? This report included information about Jennifer and the kids. Was it going well? Would there have been evidence of that? Maybe so, in which case it might have had very little effect. But this is such a black box for us with not a lot of information that it's really hard for us to have any idea what would have happened. The one thing we know is that several people have come in and told us Fotis was real excited. Fotis thought it was going to all be okay. And he was finally going to get his chance to be with the kids more, to get either full and maybe even full physical custody. According to Michelle, at one point, she said he asked her, are you ready to be a mom of 6? because it would be her daughter and his 5 kids. And so he thought this was coming, she said. It was on the way. Kelly asked me about why the judge paused so long during the afternoon session. Prosecution responded with awkwardness. I am not sure about that section. Like I say, I'm a little bit behind, so I possibly missed that. So let's see. Robin asked me, could you please define contempt of court? So it was where the court has said to do something and you showed contempt by not doing it. So, or doing the opposite. In this case, the court has said this is a sealed document. It's not going to come in the trial and it's going to be kept sealed, and you show it anyway. And it's doing something that shows your contempt, literally, for the court, that you are acting in a way that shows that you don't intend to obey, you aren't obeying what they have said and what they have asked you to do. All right, I am going to answer just like 2 more questions, and I have a couple more people to thank as well. Stephanie wants to know, have they even tied her to the actual murder? And they have not, Stephanie, and I don't think they're even trying to, because they didn't charge her with the literal murder, which is what they charged Fotis with. Now, he's not around to face the charges, but that is what he was charged with, the actual murder. Instead, she's charged with conspiring to murder Jennifer. So and she had a very strong alibi. She was shown on video at stores around there. She went to see people in the area. It's clear that she wasn't in New Canaan kidnapping and murdering Jennifer Dulos. That never happened. So, but they do think she was in on it, that she conspired. That's what the prosecution charges are. And let's see. Bree wants to know, did she have to get another lawyer for the contempt hearing because her defense attorneys gave her the report that was on her screen? It's a very good question, Bree, and we don't know how she got that report. That is undoubtedly one of the things that will be discussed during the contempt hearing. They said it was because they felt like they had a conflict of interest, that their interest might be in this direction, and then there might be, but that she might need to argue a different thing. And therefore, they didn't feel like they could represent her because they might be involved, or they said we might have information related to it that we need to present or whatever. So for that reason, it really did seem like they felt like it was more a conflict, but they didn't say specifically how she got that report. I don't know if they provided it to her and they shouldn't have, and that's an argument. We just don't know the answer on that yet. So I don't think that I thanked Nightwood for the very generous super sticker. Thank you. I appreciate that. I also want to thank Brian Cedarland. Thank you very much. And Greg has one. And oh, no, I did answer that one. I know for sure, because we talked about the audio. And Anna Banana wants to know, do you think Kent has pleaded the fifth as a deal with Michelle so that she doesn't testify? Could they be protecting each other? Well, that raises an interesting question, Anna, about whether she might do what Catherine Medbanawa did, which is strike a deal afterwards to testify against Kent McWhinney. My guess is they're not really going to try. They tried pretty hard to get her to say something about Fotis, and either she didn't know anything or she was just not going to do it. So I don't know how successful she would be at that. Could Kent and Michelle be doing a standoff? I'll take the fifth if you take the fifth. Maybe, could be. Their attorneys may have talked. I don't know what the inner workings have been on how they've done that, but it is interesting. And Debbie, what do you think would be the reprimand on the contempt if deemed to be contempt? And thank you for the generous super chat. Debbie, I would not be surprised if what the court is going to do is, and we'll never know. We will never know whether the court did this or not. But I can see the court saying, if she's convicted, then contempt is just piling on, and I'm not going to do it. Maybe I'll find her guilty, but I'm going to say 90 days running concurrently. Or if she's found not guilty, then I am frankly pretty hacked off about this, and it was really wrong, and I'm giving her 90 days, even though she otherwise would have gotten nothing at all, because this was a big deal. I would not be surprised if that's sort of what the judge's thinking is, and that's why he's going to wait until then to make his announcement. But we will never know, and that may be totally wrong. That's just my thought based on having watched him. He seems like a judge who is who cares about the individuals. So that is one of the things that I think he might be thinking about. Well, we will be live again on Friday. Please remember. Oh, last night, Mandy Strong asked me a question and I didn't answer it in a super chat. Why did Fotis use Michelle's name for the car wash, and was he setting her up? Possible. And I think the prosecution would suggest maybe that is exactly what happened. But I had another thought, Mandy. They had taken his phone and he now had a new phone and apparently a new number because he was giving out this number to people. So what if have you ever forgotten your own brand new phone number? It did occur to me, maybe he just forgot that and he wrote Michelle's number or gave them Michelle's number because he remembered that one. But unless he was asked that very question in an interrogation, which is not available to us, we don't know the answer to that, and I guess we won't since he's not here to testify about that. I want to thank Marlon and mamapinks for moderating. Please be sure to hit that like button on your way out and subscribe. We are covering this trial. We go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday every week talking about legal cases that are in the news, but this one's a big one, and we are glad to have you with us. Prosecution showed it to jury, and so you can get a pretty good look at it too. Red blood-like substance on it. He said it was even wet and leaking everywhere. That was a quote. Zip ties, a razor blade. Why were these items there? And in the back window is a bobblehead of Alec Murdaugh going back and forth.